Welcome to Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and licensed mental health counselor.
Yeah. I'd like to remind people that we've been enjoying questions. You could send them to us via our Facebook site at facebook.com/Let's Talk VT. And we also have an email site that is questions@letstalkvt.com.
And we want to thank everybody. And I also get some questions from people that I meet on the street, and people sort of talk to a little bit. And so occasionally what happens is if somebody asks me questions, I'll write it down as a question on one of the cards and bring it in. So, please, if you have any, when we first started the show, I was hoping it would be more of a dialogue with viewers and stuff. We have guests on the show, we have discussions, and we'd love to get some feedback. And, it's sort of, you sit here and it's almost like, gee, I wonder, is this all ego? We're just talking to a camera, and does anybody watch, and is it of any use? So if you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to contact us.
Yeah, we don't have anything like Nielsen ratings.
Yeah, no, so but just a comment.
Yeah, just a comment. It's nice that we hear from people on the streets, so I really enjoy that.
Okay.
So one of the questions that we have, I see vape shops and advertising for vaping all over the place. Is vaping safe? Yeah. So do you know what they've...
No, I didn't know what it was until you talked.
Yeah. So this is another, the e-cigarettes that you've maybe heard about those.
Yes, I have heard of them.
So what these are is basically liquid nicotine that then with some heat delivers vapors, and then people are able to then say, smoking these is the right term because they're not directly inhaled in the lungs, but sort of absorbed through the membranes in the mouth, just like the gums and the lozenges that work. But the idea is that people are using these, well, there's almost sort of two ways that these things are used. On the one hand, people talk about quitting smoking with these. So they get these e-cigarettes and they're inhaling a vapor from this, and they're getting nicotine delivered. So in that way, they're able to cut down on their cigarette smoking. Because one of the things that maybe not everybody's aware of is that nicotine is not by itself harmful. Just like other substances, it has a receptor in the brain that it sits into. We have nicotinic receptors, and this has certain effects. I mean, it is a stimulant. Some people find that it improves their concentration, and then once you smoke for a long time, what happens is you start to have withdrawal. So you get more and more irritable. You have these cravings for this, and so it's the smoke and the chemicals and the products in the smoke that are the dangerous thing around smoking. So the idea is that we can find some way of using nicotine to get that into your receptors. That's much safer than through tobacco smoke. But one of the things is that, at least tobacco smoke, we've had institutes studying this. There's been research around this. We have a very good idea of the components of smoke and the impact it has on the lungs and the cardiovascular system. But some of the concerns is we don't know if vaping is safe. Whether this combustion that happens is delivering sort of byproducts at all. And so over the long course of time, if people were vaping, let's say, for 10 or 20 years, would we start to see anything that is detrimental to people's health? And so that's where a lot of people come off on the reservations around this and calling for regulations, is we don't know much about, we don't know anything about the long-term impact of these things.
Yeah. Questions like this make me feel like, when I leave the show, you should get a 20-year-old on the show to be with you.
Yeah, and we can't keep up.
I definitely can't keep up. I mean, I had a hard enough time quitting cigarettes, and the idea that I would go out and find another way to get nicotine is just beyond me. Well,
and that's that's some people criticize this as well. I mean, if you drive around enough, you can see there's a vape shop that's open up in town. They're in other towns in Brattleboro as well. Gas stations, convenience stores. We sell vape here. And some folks are concerned that what this is doing is maybe sort of turning on younger people to nicotine.
Right.
There are I guess you call them vaping lounges, maybe, but I mean, it sort of reminds me of a bar scene when I've seen pictures of these things with the vapeologist behind the counter and patrons there who are trying various sort of, and then they're flavored nicotines. You have hookah lounges these days where you sort of go and share in the nicotine and this. And some folks are afraid that this is actually going to be sort of an introduction to nicotine by younger kids who might think, hey, this is cool, and then develop a hankering for nicotine, and then sort of maybe progress and move on. Although there's still discussion about this, about whether there's any evidence to support that, or if it's just suspicions that this might happen.
It just makes me crazy. My father died a horrible death in a VA hospital of lung cancer, throat cancer. First the lung and then his throat. I smoked Camels and Cool Lights for years, and then I quit, and 25 years later, I go in for an exam in the hospital, and the guy says, I have COPD, and I say, he says, did you ever smoke? And I said, yeah, I smoked for about 20 years. He goes, well, that's why.
Yeah.
And so now I got a pump, and I got oxygen, and I have COPD, and it's not going to go away. I suppose it's going to get worse over time, but the idea of developing new and more interesting ways to have cigarettes, to have nicotine, I don't know, I just don't get it. It really is beyond me. It's like really,
it's a tough call.
But it's okay.
Because I think one of the tobacco companies, I'm not sure if it's R.J. Reynolds or Philip Morris, is getting into this business of developing vape products. But my understanding is that most of the companies are smaller companies, in that the tobacco industry is actually seeing them as competitive rather than sort of a cooperative, or I guess introducing people to hopefully their products in the future. So it's uncertain in how that turns out. But when you talk about sort of, what in your own experience, and I think all of us have known people who suffer from the effects of smoking, 6 million people a year die from the effects of smoking. And the idea is that maybe looking at just sort of a harm reduction model, so sort of from a public health perspective, that going from smoking to vaping significantly decreases the harm that one gets from either one of these products. And that by itself might be a good first step, or in the scope of the health of the population, actually valuable.
Right. Well, I don't know. It's just hard for me to sort of grasp. It's the same thing with the. I told you I saw something in the paper, the news, or somewhere, that they've reduced alcohol to powders, and it's been approved to sell. It's going to be sold like Kool-Aid. I mean, little packages of alcohol. You put it in water and have a drink. Yeah. And it's just another way, it just sort of strikes me. It's just another thing, and now most people say marijuana is going to be legal and there's no way of stopping it, and blah blah blah. And I was reading an article about someone. They were talking about people in their 80s where life becomes easier because you realize you're not going to be around to solve all these problems, and that they're going to be solved, and things are going to happen, and you might as well sit back and relax. And I think that's rapidly happening to me. Because there's things that I worry about, that I think are dangerous, that I think are not like real healthy, like having alcohol in a powder. And if you can imagine how I used to play with Kool-Aid as a kid,
pixie sticks, right? These little straws that are filled with the sugared powder.
Imagine that. And also just this idea that, maybe these things are what's going to be in the future. They're not part of my life. Maybe they'll be part of my grandson's life. So who knows? I guess I'm not going to try and worry about it too much.
All right. Tough to tell. We could say that the jury is out. Even some public health professionals divide themselves for being for and being against these products.
Yeah. The idea of, like, I can remember when I smoked a lot, and if you were home and you didn't have any cigarettes, you would get in the car, go get a pack. I mean, you would find, and if you've ever been so down and out, you're looking in ashtrays for, leftovers, and, you get to a point where you always have a stash or roll of your own, can of tobacco and stuff, and the idea of being without a cigarette is not a good thing. You see people grubbing, borrowing cigarettes and hitting other people.
Well, I think regardless of how this plays out, from public health perspective, the goal that I've seen named many times is that we develop a smoke-free generation.
Yeah.
That the kids growing up now, or the next generation of children are born, actually grow up not smoking, and that is something, a piece of the past. And some people think this might be a step on the way to then getting to older generations to move along those lines too.
Right. And, you know, I'll stop. It's an interesting industry. I mean, you know, a lot of people thought when the no smoking generation came along, American tobacco companies' stock would go down and, you know, and all fall off the face of the earth. It's not true. They just sold more cigarettes in Africa and China. China now and Africa have rapidly increasing tobacco and the problems that go along with it, and you know,
and appealing to younger generations.
Just leave it alone.
Like the colorfulness, the flavors with the vaping.
Yeah.
There's clearly marketing happening to younger people to keep these products out there. And vaping is already a couple of $1 billion industry.
Okay. Well, here's a question that I could actually talk about.
Okay.
But I have already. I'll just go very briefly with it. Is there a difference between problem drinker and alcoholic? And I think that's just a matter of a label. I mean, you know, who's an alcoholic? I don't know. I get AA sort of says that, you know, you have to admit that you're an alcoholic. I think most alcoholics know they're alcoholics. I used to joke that a heavy drinker is somebody who's an alcoholic with a job. I mean, they know, you know, when you say heavy drinker, you're not talking about somebody who is overweight. I mean, you're talking about somebody who drinks a lot and probably drinks daily. And I think by some definitions, they're alcohol dependent. A problem drinker, I think, is a more you know, the new DSM judges alcoholism by severity. So I guess, you know, there's alcoholic and then there's heavy drinker, and I guess problem drinker is down at the other end.
Well, it's a different set of labels.
It's a different set of labels. That's all it is.
Mild, moderate, and severe.
Right, and it's a way of looking at it. You know, if a person's having problems, you know, and usually what it means is that, you know, they're having problems at work or they're having problems in the family or something like that. It could be the early onset of the disease, where you just begin to have some problems and you rationalize and justify your drinking. You're trying to, like you see some alcoholics stop drinking whiskey because they get violent when they drink whiskey, or they get really drunk and they pass out, and so they get into drinking beer. Or you'll see some alcoholics you know, drink a bottle of wine, and they sort of convince themselves that drinking a bottle of wine is sort of civilized, and you know, and it's not really. But you know, every day they put away a box. You know, I mean, by the time you're drinking a box of wine, you know, you're probably going at it. So that's the only thing I would say. I mean, neither one of them is a problem drinker is probably less so. It's a way of thinking about it. It's just like it's causing problems in your life, and you need to take a look at it. And that, like I said, it's probably the first awareness that it's, you know, you're missing time at work or something like that. Whereas an alcoholic, I think it's a little bit more clear. It's kind of sad, like the World Health Organization, they measure alcoholism by how many people die of cirrhosis.
Right.
So by that point, it's sort of academic whether or not you're an alcoholic. I mean, if you die from alcoholism, I guess you're an alcoholic. I mean, and not to be silly about it or flippant about it, but I think that's one.
And this has different meanings too. I think that you know, in the literature, when people talk about a problem drinker, they sort of describe it as being not quite at the point of, say, clearly being, you know, moderate or severe level of alcohol misuse, but almost defining it by, you know, men drinking, you know, 3 or more drinks a day, and women drinking, you know, 2 or more drinks per day. But as you were talking about this, it started to make me think that, you know, I'm not going to call myself a problem drinker, but I might call myself a functional alcoholic.
Yeah,
and I'm wondering too, it's sort of, you know, who's delivering this label, and you know, what are people defending themselves against?
Right, and if you told me you were a 14-year-old kid in high school and you drink every weekend, I think I would say you got a problem.
Right.
I mean, I would. You know, whether or not you're an alcoholic, let's not go there. It seems voluntary, and you don't drink on Tuesdays and Thursdays because you have band practice. I don't know. I mean, but you know, I mean, you can start to look at it. You look at some fraternities and you look at some of this behavior. I saw an article today in the paper, and they were talking about the sexual abuse on the campuses, and every time you read about that, alcohol is present. And the matter of fact, I was reading, somebody was saying they were thinking about outlawing hard liquor on the campus. Now, they're already 21 years old to drink, but
Right.
they recognize that the 18, 19-year and 20-year-old in college is drinking in fraternity houses, but maybe it'd be safer if they just drank beer, that instead of getting that high level of alcohol which causes people to black out or totally become disinhibited. So I mean, I think it's is that a problem? I would say yes. I would say that alcohol is a problem on the campus, especially when you look at some of the things that are happening within some of the fraternities and some of the crime that's committed.
And I think maybe we're almost talking about sort of different, two different types of spectrums here. The one is sort of, how much do you drink? Right, from a problem to being alcoholic, and the other one's sort of a spectrum across time. I mean, to be called if you're going to talk about, a frat kid who's having, too much alcohol and winding up drunk on weekends, you might describe him more as a problem drinker as opposed to a functional alcoholic. That usually we look at sort of more time to have elapsed before we might use that sort of a label with somebody.
And when I was growing up, there were lots of guys, their fathers, that drank every day, and they were firemen, they were post office employees. I mean, and they I don't want to judge them, but by a lot of measures, you would say they were alcoholic or alcohol dependent anyway. And there would be domestic violence. I mean, there was some tough stuff going on. Alcohol was sort of part of some people's lifestyles, and I think on that level, some of that has changed. I mean, nowadays, there's interventions and EAPs, and some employees don't really deal with, drunken employees. Back in that day, I mean, I can remember a fireman, a friend of the family fireman, who was clearly an alcoholic, drank a lot, and he ended up just driving the chief around. Nobody put him on the truck. Nobody allowed him to get on the fire truck or go up the ladders. And they did it because he was in his 40s or 50s. I don't know. It's hard for me to judge when you're, I knew him when I was a kid. Everybody over 30 is old. But anyway, it was a way of protecting him. And I don't think that happens anymore. I mean, maybe it does, maybe there's more, but I think that's part of the idea, that there were people who were clearly alcoholic, and families and communities sort of protected them. And they were working class men, and maybe also, and I don't have knowledge of this, but maybe also in other professional folks, they were alcoholic and known by other professionals, and they were taken care of. But I would say it was definitely true when I was growing up that there was people who drank fairly steady every day in the bar, every night at home, and they had jobs and they worked and had families. But it wasn't a picnic for their family, and it wasn't a picnic for them. And I don't think you want to think of a functional alcoholic as something to aspire to be.
Right.
I must tell you. I mean, maybe it's one thing to keep the paycheck coming in the family. Back then, when I was growing up, there was very few divorces, and Catholic neighborhood and everything, and so people were stuck with the alcoholic in the house. But it's not like you're getting away with something if you say you're a functional alcoholic.
Yeah. It might be these things are sort of different steps along a path that at any point you might want to sort of turn around and step off that path.
An interesting phenomenon. I will stop with this, but I mean, one of the things that happens. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and we were talking about addicts, alcoholics, and he said something about people coming into recovery centers, turning points, and stuff like that. And I said, one of the interesting things about when you first start that journey of recovery, you go to a turning point or you go into treatment, is that yesterday's liability, your addiction, when you get into recovery, it actually becomes an asset. I mean, in some ways, it's that ability to help others. It also becomes the beginning of growing and making a new life for yourself. And so that's why a lot of people, if you hear somebody say, I'm a grateful alcoholic, what they're trying to say is that because of my alcoholism, I had to get sober. And the way I got sober was to develop a different life and live a different life. And because of that, I am grateful that I got to that point. And I don't mean to be silly about this, but it's interesting that some of these labels, when you're avoiding them or afraid of the label because what they mean, but when you own the label, when you say, no, that's really what I am, that is who I am, later on it's not really that much of a shame. It's really more like, okay, that's where I was, and I've managed to live with it, I've managed to overcome it, and I no longer consider it a liability.
Growth and maturity through adversity, right? That's how we all do it.
I mean, these are labels: problem drinker, alcoholic. They're all just ways of thinking about it, and I hope that answered the question.
Okay. Yeah, let's hope so. If not, write another one.
We'll try again. All right.
So this next question, are there different types of bipolar? Okay. Yeah. There's some people will tell you if you go see enough psychiatrists, eventually you can pick up the label bipolar. So there is sort of a watering down from what we used to consider the sort of manic depressive illness, where quite clearly, if anybody reads literature, I think Sherlock Holmes, the character, was supposedly a very good description of manic depression, where the mania being periods of being very energetic and up and having very big ideas and sort of high sense of yourself, what we call grandiosity, talking and thinking so quickly and just having boundless energy and not able to sleep, and then at the other end of the scale sort of crashing after that, and then having very dark, black, depressive episodes after that. And then recently we've seen people talked about childhood bipolar, that some children seem sort of out of control, energetic, angry, seemingly sort of poorly behaved, which is probably not a very good term, and just really, behaviorally difficult, whether there's sort of a childhood bipolar. And people have talked about bipolar type 2. Which is, if you consider that, like say, bipolar is probably like a real swing from high mania to very low depressions, that then bipolar 2 is a smaller range of just those similar types of symptoms, with having a lot of energy but still sleeping, not quite developing those sort of grandiose thoughts, but also be sort of a highly energetic, productive person is what we might think about with the bipolar type 2. And I feel like I can't. This just strikes me too as an opportunity to sort of criticize the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and how much that is influenced by various sort of research camps and by the pharmaceutical industry. People sort of like, I think the child of bipolar is a really good example of how two different camps in different university settings, where we're seeking sort of to define what would be considered pediatric or childhood bipolar disorder. And you can't get away from the idea that pharmaceuticals are the primary treatment for this, and therefore drive research. And so there's a lot of contamination in how these things are worked out, and that the DSM, there's nothing. It's a low level of science. It's a bunch of experts sitting around, and then you get sort of competition from various camps on this. And I think, we see bipolar being prescribed as often, diagnosed as often it is, quite often people are looking for an answer for why am I struggling? And if you don't spend a lot of time questioning, sort of digging deeper, then we come up with very sort of superficial applications of labels that were, quite serious when you look at how they affected people with, say, true bipolar disorder or bipolar type 1, with sort of full-fledged mania and the behaviors that came with that.
And I'm glad you say that, because my experience, I worked 29 years in a psychiatric hospital. But primarily my work was with dual disorder clients and people who had substance abuse. And that was what I was asked to work with them and evaluate and make recommendations and treatment planning about. But if you see somebody who's truly in a manic state, or sometimes you see almost a psychosis, and I remember working with Dr. Mandel, and one of the nice things he did one day, though he was actually sort of lecturing us, me, was, don't give me a diagnosis, give me the symptoms.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I think that, that really helped me in some way. It was sort of humbling because, I've got, who I am and all that foolishness, but it's true. No, really, because I think a lot of times you sort of look at something, and I know in my field, especially with the co-occurring substance abuse and the cocaine and everything else that went on, I don't know. It was sort of tricky, and you know, I would go to a conference on the Cape or something, and somebody would get up and say, "Oh, you shouldn't make a diagnosis until they've been sober, you know, 6 months or 3 months or something." And then the reality would be that sometimes we'd be working with people, and you would just say, "Well, we need to do something. This person is really in distress, and they're really." I mean, the original term "maniac," manic. I mean,
Right.
they're really,
I mean,
you
there's
know,
a craziness to it.
that's right, and let's help them. And so you would make a diagnosis, you would prescribe a medicine. So it was only later on when I got involved with, you know, the bipolar 1 and unipolar, and then multiple different ideas about what it was, and rapid cycle and everything. So I think, you know, again, I sound like this old person, but, you know, way back when bipolar was bipolar, like, you know, right. Extended periods of depression, manic behaviors, very clear, you know. But I think it's like a lot of things. It seems like it's grown almost organically. It's become more or something.
I mean, and the earlier question about you know, vaping and tobacco, and
yeah.
There's this sort of sense to this that in a way we're trying to sell these diagnoses to more and more people. And the more and more people that accept this label, the more and more people sort of want our product, which might be psychiatric care, prescribing, therapy, what have you. And it just has that sort of feeling to it.
Yeah.
And none of it is particularly descriptive. So people tend to latch on to what suits them, you know, with these sort of watered down meanings. Like people they can't sleep for a couple of nights, or they have periods of feeling good or energetic that intersperse with, you know, being depressed, or moods that change throughout the day. And sure, that's uncomfortable. You would like to do better, but it doesn't really meet the criteria for, say, the old-fashioned, you know, manic depressive disorder.
Right, and you know, part of it is so difficult is that these are doctors and nurses and therapists who really care about people. I'm sorry, they do. I mean, they really do. I mean, they're dedicated their life, and you know, we're working in a hospital. We're trying to help people, and this is how. I mean, you just get into that. I mean, you know, you start to diagnose, but they don't quite meet that criteria, but it looks like this, and we have to sort of, you know, treat that, and we want to relieve the symptoms. We have a limited time. It just seemed to. I mean, I don't want to misrepresent this as if people had poor intentions.
Right.
I mean, people have good intentions. I think even the people who write the DSM-5. I mean, I think they have good intentions. Right. I think they, you know, you can argue about it philosophically about, you know, what's going on in the relationship between diagnosis and big pharma, and the people's desire to feel better, you know, not to experience whatever they're experiencing.
And I feel compelled to say, I mean, these perspectives that I have a talk about here, also criticizing pharma, criticizing the DSM. I mean, these are sort of a product of my professional development. I've you know, started a little bit later. I had teachers who also criticized this. I've had experiences then coming into psychiatry, you know, reading of people I've met, like some of the guests we've had on the show. And I mean, I'm not alone in these opinions. There is, you could find a large number of people sort of share these impressions. I mean, books are written, camps are there. By the same token, a lot of better trained or longer working psychiatrists and folks have a different perspective on this. So I don't mean that every diagnosis of bipolar is necessarily inaccurate. What I always ask when people tell me this is, does that resonate with you? Yeah. Does this diagnosis make sense? And if it does, then you need to sort of work with that as a theory to describe what you're struggling with, and then to wonder if maybe you're not on a path, and that will help you to be better, to help you be worse.
Right, and you have to look at the whole thing. And adolescent bipolar, the diagnosis. Yeah, we have one more question here, and we're toward the end of the show, but I do want to acknowledge that it came in. It says, "Can I be in AA but not have belief in God?" I
mean, coming, of course, maybe that God is mentioned so often in the steps.
You and I, we review these questions, we talk about them, and I said, well, the answer could be yes or no, right?
We're done.
Either one, which one. Yeah. But we're going to talk more about this next week. I'll talk a little bit more about it. It's really an important question, and many people are trying to duplicate some of the positive outcomes of AA, and at the same time, you find a lot of people struggling with this whole concept because people want a more secular and even arguing about spirituality. So that's a great question, and I'm not trying to avoid it. we'll answer it.
I mean, anything about God is a very big question.
Right. Well put.
All right, good.
Or very little. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for watching.